Now, the second annual Sanlam ESG Barometer sheds light on how listed companies across the continent are driving ESG integration to help foster a more sustainable future. Research for the report was conducted by Kruthum. The organization's head of impact investing research, Nicole Martens, joins us with greater perspective on ESG additionality approach and what it suggests for and about African businesses. Nicole, thank you for your time and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
Right, we are in our second year of the Sanlam ESG Barometer, and I believe we expanded the scope a little bit this year, taking a look also at companies listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. Help us make sense of that.
Yeah, thank you so much. We did decide that this was the first year we were going to expand to different markets with the intention that over time we might expand to other African markets as well, including the Kenyan companies was really interesting given the progressive policy environment that we see there when it comes to ESG issues, particularly climate.
So maybe let's start off by taking a look at what we've seen in South Africa as compared to maybe the first year that we had the barometer, and then giving us some more insights in what we might be seeing in Kenya.
Yeah, fantastic. So when we look at the findings for this year compared to last year, what is pleasing to see is that there is a lot of alignment in terms of the purpose behind these ESG strategies, and that's really to deliver impact. So a lot of the companies are saying that the reason they have these strategies first and foremost is to attract investment, but they go far beyond the minimum requirements that investors might have, and they're really trying to make a difference. When you compare that to some of the Kenyan companies, the only major difference is really around the specific sustainable development goals or focus areas that they might have.
I'm actually keen to speak on then the concept of additionality here and why that is important as we try to take stock of how ESG is playing out on the African continent.
Sure. So when we're talking about additionality, we're really having a look at are companies adding value that wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for their intervention? So are they making investments or designing programs or interventions that create value outside of their normal business as usual? And it's really important to us that we look at this because it speaks to the intentionality of these companies, right? So they really are aiming to do good rather than sort of unintentionally or inadvertently doing so.
What I'm also, I think, very encouraged by here is, of course, we are seeing parts of the world, Nicole, maybe more in the West and developed world, where there's anti-ESG sentiments that are gaining ground. But that's not the case with Africa. And I think that does show that we can actually maybe, take ESG on and give it more of an African spin.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually one of the questions that we did ask the companies was how they expect their ESG strategies or their approach to ESG to be affected by what we'll call this backlash against ESG. And it was really encouraging to find that the respondents actually said that they didn't expect that it would have a real impact on their approach or their strategies. They were a little bit concerned that it might affect the attitude of their investors, which is understandable given that we have a lot of sort of US-based financial institutions that do affect the markets. But it's great to see that the companies that we spoke to see the value of ESG integration despite sort of the tumultuous environment.
I'm also keen to speak about sustainable finance and how that's playing itself out on the back of ESG on the continent.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is when we looked at the company's motivations, right, for integrating ESG, the top rated reason to have an ESG strategy was to attract investors in the first place. What we also saw was that about 2/3 of the investors of the companies stated that even though it's important to attract investors, they don't get a better cost of capital for integrating ESG. So they don't get any sort of bonus points or preferential treatment for having an ESG strategy, which is really interesting because what it suggests is that investors are conveying a message to companies that to have an ESG strategy is a bare minimum requirement. It's not something that you're going to get extra points for. So that drive from the finance side is really powerful in getting companies to sort of change their behavior.
Very interesting indeed. Nicole, let's talk about the importance of local leadership in driving ESG.
Yeah, I do think that it's really important. And what we would traditionally think when you look at the theory is that policy and regulation would be where that big push comes from. But what the survey showed us was that a lot of the companies that we spoke to are unaffected, well, not unaffected, but it's not their main driver, right? So the leadership is actually coming from the companies. They're going beyond what they're currently mandated to do to deliver impact beyond what they're required to deliver. And that's really the leadership that we want to see. And we want to see companies taking that proactive, progressive step. And what the survey would suggest is that a lot of the companies on the South African and the Kenyan exchanges are really trying to do that.
And might it be beneficial, or is it even, in the pipeline here, Nicole, to standardize ESG standards, disclosures, understanding throughout the continent, especially as we try to create a more integrated continent?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that there's been a lot of discussion about potentially creating more nuanced reporting frameworks or disclosure frameworks. But what we saw in the barometer is that a lot of the international best practice frameworks are actually being adopted by our local companies in any case, with about 2/3 of them saying that they do plan to adopt the ISSB, which is an international sort of integration framework that's coming soon, without it being mandatory to do so. So they do plan to do so within the next year or two. So on one hand, you've got sort of the push for more localized or nuanced reporting frameworks, but it does seem that these companies have no problem adopting the international frameworks that are available to them.
Well, interesting insights indeed, Nicole. Thank you so much for taking us through the barometer, the 2024 barometer, that is. That was Nicole Martens, head of impact investing research at Kruthum.